Hey, and welcome to another episode of the Environmental Answers podcast, EnvAns for short, with your host, Tiana Elame. Today is a host takeover episode. It's episode 113. I can't believe it. A takeover episode. The goal of today's episode is to remind you what Environmental Answers is about, tell you a little bit about me, and answer some questions we've gotten in over the last couple months regarding the podcast. So let's start with an introduction to who I am and why this is what it is. My name is Tiana Elame. I am the CEO and founder of Environmental Answers, EnvAns for short. We're on a mission to reduce the fear of things that are related to the environment by increasing everyone's environmental intelligence. And what does that look like? Asking a lot of questions. I'm reminded of the importance of asking questions because I have a young child that hasn't started speaking yet, but is very, very curious. And if you know anything about like the education process and how we acquire knowledge, it starts from a perspective or question we have. And so that is the origin of the Environmental Answers podcast. Is really stimulating conversations and questions and dialogues around environmental issues. I started my career back in 2009 as an AmeriCorps, did the Maryland Conservation Corps, and it was one of the most life-changing experiences for me because, frankly, I had just gone to college, just gone to high school, hadn't even gone to college yet, and I was trying to decide if I wanted to be an engineer or an environmental science professional. Well, I chose the environmental science industry because it was something that was very unique to me, especially at that time. I didn't have a whole lot of role models, immediate circle that knew what it was that I was trying to do, but I realized that environmental related work was something I was passionate about. So after I did my AmeriCorps program, or I should say, while I was doing my AmeriCorps program, I had the opportunity to travel around the United States, but also specifically in the state of Maryland. And when I was there, I looked and learned about the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, which had a environmental science degree and was a small historical Black college, which were two things that I really wanted for myself for my college experience, primarily because I had already loved rocks and I used to collect rocks as a child. And it was like, okay, I'm going to go to school for environmental related stuff. Let me go somewhere that one, I can grow and flourish, but also learn more about my culture and history. And that's what UMES was able to provide for me. I was really grateful for the opportunity to go to that university because they were able to set me up with unique opportunities. I remember my sophomore year, I worked at the National Aquarium in Baltimore because they had a conservation program specifically designed to get more people from that university and other HBCUs along the East Coast to work specifically in marine science. So that's what I got to do when I did that opportunity. And so, in understanding what I did as an AmeriCorps, I realized that environmental was more of what I wanted to do. I was more interested in understanding that dynamic versus engineering. Although, what's funny, if you fast forward a little bit into my career, I ended up working on large scale construction projects. So, engineering and construction weren't out of my life. It just wasn't my primary focus. I was able to do my program at UMES and I was recruited out of undergrad to work for the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. I serviced as a biologist for them for a number of years, specifically getting to work in their headquarters region. I actually started as an information specialist answering calls on behalf of the public where they would call in and ask various questions from CITES permits. So that's an international permit law. A lot of those calls were centered around the ivory crush at that time and people being interested in like having ivory imported and what did that mean? And if I'm inheriting something, people called about that. There were also permits when it came to birds and understanding take and what that actually meant when we were impacting species. So I was able to answer those calls. And then after that, I ended up working at the National Conservation Training Center. And that's when I think I started to really develop a desire for education and understanding how important training is to the environmental work. Again, going back to what I kind of said at the beginning of this takeover, that questions really help to design how we think about the things that we do. So with that in mind, I was at the National Conservation Training Center, also known as NCTC, and I got to host something called Conservation Connect. So it was a live series where we were able to answer questions similar to how I think about environmental answers, but specifically for like middle school age students. I did get the opportunity to record a pre-recorded episode in the field, which was an in-field episode with a black bear. And for me, studying environmental science, like my concentration was marine science. and I hadn't had the opportunity to work with like terrestrial species. So getting to work with like a black bear and record a black bear and understand that whole dynamic was really exciting for me at that time. I was still very early in my career. And I was understanding like how all of the dynamics of the work that goes into educating generations of people who work in or around environmental related work. So that was NCTC and the Maryland Conservation Corps for me, lining up those two things. After that, I actually moved to California. And in California, I worked on several things. One is the high-speed rail train. I also worked for the California Department of Transportation. All of the positions that I held, I had the title of biologist, or I was dealing with like environmental compliance, which all of the work when it comes to the environmental industry is interesting how there can be various titles, but they all are the same type of works. Most of the time I had the title of biologist, but I also know people who might have the title of environmental scientist, or you might have environmental program manager. It just depends on where you're at in the industry, but you're doing similar work. A lot of the environmental work has been centered traditionally around permitting. And so I have a lot of experience with permitting. I also have experience with writing documents. They're like large biological documents, research documents like biological opinions or biological assessments, specifically centered around that construction and engineering part or like building of different things and resources. When I left California, which was in 2021, I was working on the high-speed rail train and I was a project oversight biologist. So I was at the top of the, I would say, biology food chain, for lack of better words, for a large-scale construction project. If you look up the high-speed rail train, it's actually a multi-billion-dollar project. So being able to do that at such a early and pivotal point in my career, I gained a lot of perspective about like what it is that it takes for environmental work to get done and how it can either speed up or slow down different processes. I decided to stop and go and get my master's of environmental management from Duke. I specifically focused in what it meant to be an environmental leader, so the Duke Environmental Leadership Program, Dell MEM. And during that time, I focused on a couple different projects. The first project I thought about doing was creating almost like a consultancy for training construction folks to have perspective about environmental related things. That looked like me raising money, getting resources together to go to what's called the World of Concrete. It's like World of Concrete conference. It's a collective of people that are coming from literally all over the world to Vegas to talk about concrete, which at the time it seemed very different and separated. If someone was saying like, Tiana, why would you as an environmentalist go to a construction conference for concrete? Well, concrete has something big to do with the amount of emissions that goes out with the construction industry putting out a certain amount of energy is used for creating a concrete and how necessary it is for the construction process. So seeing how we could think about the environment more was my pitch. They have like hundreds and hundreds of booths. And I went and I did a lot of primary research and interviewing people and asking them if I created an environmental consulting firm that was centered around training for construction folks, would this be something you would be interested in? The bottom line that I got from that was that, no, we're not interested in that. That's too expensive. Construction margins are really low. So like when it comes to profitability, Tiana, we don't have the bandwidth or money to pay you for this, but maybe if you went and looked at the consumer. So again, I was in my graduate school experience. I had a little bit more flexibility at the time to set up, like, I would say interviews or experiences where I got to talk to homeowners and ask them about what part of the environmental sphere are you interested in? The feedback that I got was that people were mostly interested in renewable energy and solar panels. But the process for buying and getting solar panels flat out just did not work for them. They felt like it was really salesy and uncomfortable. They felt like they got trapped. And this is from different perspectives around the country. And I was doing this work because I was like, how can I get to the point where I feel like some of these environmental related matters are just ingrained in how we process versus it being like separated. And that's when I started to realize like, well, maybe I need to look at entrepreneurship. Let me really dig into building a business around this, not just consulting, not just like working to support other things, but more so flip it on its head. How can I make it so that there are more profitable businesses that are centered on the point of environmental related matters? So I ended up creating what's known as EnvAns now. I went through and learned about startup what that looks like. I got an entrepreneur certificate while I was at Duke. I learned how to do customer discovery and really dive deeper into that. It wasn't just the idea of like having a construction related company support. It was more of like, how can I fundamentally develop a new way of looking at environmental related things from the beginning to the middle to the end. And that's how I got to environmental answers. If you look up EnvAns in my name, you might find an article that was put out by a local paper here in the Triangle called Gritbeat, where I talked about the fact that I wanted to design a search engine tool for people to ask their questions directly, which is still one of my goals, but we haven't gotten as far because of the rise of AI and everyone would go to like ChatGPT now. And so like learning about like how quickly you need to move when you have an idea was a whole nother thing for me and this whole like developing a business life. But the goal was to create a tool where you as a homeowner could maybe search some questions about maybe if you want to design your house more sustainably and you didn't have to deal with a direct salesperson. And that was because, like I said, when I was doing my research for environmental answers initially, and I learned about the fact that it was the homeowners who maybe could help me to drive a profitable circle of revenue. Renewable energy or solar came as a thing. And then I was like, well, if I don't want to do door-to-door sales, maybe if I do a design of a search engine tool where they could answer or ask questions directly, then we can provide them the unique answers that they need. Still working on that idea. But again, with the rise of artificial intelligence and what's going on there, there's already tools to compete with, which again, my original background was biology. So having to understand like competition, what that looks like, these are all new ways of thinking about work for me. So I've learned so much in this environmental space that I'm like, okay, it's not just about permits. It's not just about this. How do we get people to understand what's going on and enjoy it, not necessarily fear it? So again, back to that article, if you Google my name in environmental answers, it should say something along the facts that my mission is to help to reduce climate change fear of climate change. And that's just because at this point in life, fear shouldn't be the frontal way of functioning when it comes to this work. I think that something that I admire about maybe like the medical field and other fields, yeah, people might fear their condition, but they know that there is a reliable point of contact that maybe they can get some support and they rely in. I feel like that's a little shaky. This is my 2 cents within the environmental industry. A lot of people don't have like the one, okay, like we don't have like an environmental doctor. And maybe we do. We have people who study environmental, but I mean like the way that people perceive it, the general population perceives environmental related matters does not necessarily yield towards them knowing a point person to go to. So when I started this podcast, the thought was to document those who are working in the environmental field who are these doctors, not necessarily PhD or doctor, but these leaders, these points of truth, source of truth, so that they could share what they're doing. Because the work is actually happening that needs to be done in order for us to make change. But it's hard when there's so much doom and gloom, like on TV traditionally, when we talk about some of these environmental challenges. But like, now that we know that certain things are a problem, there are people who are doing the work. We just need to support them, learn about what they're doing, and increase our overall environmental intelligence. So I've had 12 amazing episodes. This is technically episode 13. Episode 14 and 15 will be in your ears next week. I'm really, really excited about those episodes. Again, the goal is to really amplify the work that is coming and is happening. I know the 2 episodes that are coming up, one is about reuse and like uplifting reuse and how that can be a system of change. Yeah, people know to recycle, and we talked about that in episode 112. If you want to know more about recycling and the innovation that's happening there, I would definitely encourage you to go back and listen to that episode with the founder of Scrap. You could totally learn more about that. But this upcoming episode is actually on reuse and understanding that economy and how, like, it's more than just you washing your dishes at home. We reuse all the time. Imagine if there's other places we can create those systems, maybe in the elementary schools and the other spaces that we're reusing it and making it more of a standard practice, and how that has a significant impact on how we interact with our environment. The next episode, 115, will be focused on an innovative process for creating leather. Now, if you know anything about leather, you know that it directly impacts the species of animal that actually creates a lot of methane and maybe leads to us having more and more livestock that end up being taken away or pass away, or then the process of having to deal with the leather. Well, The innovation is centered around cultivating leather specifically from a live animal, but not having to kill that animal. And so I'm really looking forward to that episode as well. And I would say the episodes last about 30 minutes. This episode, I may or may not go a little bit longer. It just depends on one, if I get any questions. I see that there's some people on live. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Or if you have any ideas of things you want me to talk about, I'm totally open to answer that. A big part of this podcast platform is to encourage people to answer and ask questions live. But the main point is that I'm really excited that I've made it this far in the podcast. I have another couple episodes that are going to happen before the end of the year. I decided to number this podcast series based on the year versus season because I guess I was going back and forth on if I wanted this to be episode like 2 of season, like, or episode 1 of season 2. But I was like, no, actually, this is my first year of doing this podcast. When I'm documenting like the process of developing a podcast and what this podcast is serving for, I like the idea of it just being year 1 and everything that happened in the first year of the podcast will have a 1 in front of it. And that's just that. So that is my thought on that. I'm trying to think. I put down some notes on things I wanted to like also share with you all. If you are on LinkedIn, you may already know this. I recently took an appointment as a lecturer at NC State. So that is something that's really big for the podcast because as I continue to build out what I am doing in my startup, I love the fact that I have the opportunity to engage with the next generation of environmental leaders, specifically coming out of NC State and around, the Triangle area. I am very grateful to be speaking and talking on renewable energy. As I continue to do this work, and if you have been studying and following some of the environmental challenges of the day, a lot of it has to do with maybe us being better about where our energy is coming from. So I'm really looking forward to having some energy-focused leaders on the podcast in the coming months, because this is something that's very critical to the overall mission. And again, the mission of the podcast is to make it so that more people are just aware of the work that people are doing in the environmental industry. I know that when I started, when I did my AmeriCorps program back in 2009, there was only so many ideas I had about like what it meant to be an environmental leader and what that looks like. And something that this podcast really challenges is the fact that it's not just one type of person. It's not just the person that's maybe knowing all the things about the birds or the bees. It's actually someone who's knowing more about different things than just that. And there's nothing wrong with just that because we need all of the pieces, So I'm looking back at like some of the episodes, like when we talked about, let's see, episode 1, I was a new climate, which it was a really awesome episode, getting to sit down with environmental leader Reba and specifically looking at like what does it mean for the environmental industry now, to the next episode, which was episode 2, looking at evidence-based sustainability and being able to understand the circular economy better. That was with Maddie. I really enjoyed that episode. Zooming in a little bit more, we looked at zero waste nourishment. So this was with Chef Netta. I know that this episode for me was dynamic because, typically when we get food, especially if it's packaged, it's always like wrapped. There's always a lot of trash associated with it. I had at that time also started being a part of a community garden. So like learning more from her about how to really dive into healthy foods and reduce the amount of waste associated with that. I know she set up like a system for like having a chef that's cooking your food for your area is significantly less wasteful because chefs have more time and the ability to create mass amounts of meals, and it can reduce, and looking at as a sustainable pathway for the future of how to think about how to nourish yourself. We also looked at episode 104. We looked at like the sustainable returns playbook, understanding how to really look at where your money is going for a return that is sustainable, both for your pocket, but also for the planet. New waste ways. That was a great episode. We got to sit down with John and really talk about like what he's developing in the Triangle area, which are these receptacles that can take in smart sort trash or your waste. And so new waste ways and understanding how like there's so many parts to these environmental systems that just haven't been set up yet. I know like a personal opinion about this is that like when it comes to the environment to work, it's just that there's so many opportunities of what we just did not think about when we were considering building. I know I was talking to my spouse earlier today about in California how there are wildlife corridors and how when we built trains hundreds of years ago when trains first came about. Fact check me on that. Anyway, the train point is that it's centered around there weren't wildlife corridors, so they couldn't cross. And so that led to more accidents. But like designing with the environment in mind is just like something that we hope to continue to amplify here. So having new wasteways, a sustainable planning book, zero waste nutrition, these are all pathways for environmental answers. We also did an episode called Energy, What's the Impact? I really like this episode because we got to sit down with Jessica and she brought her 20 years of experience from the field of archaeology and environmental planning and how it's all connected and pulling people into the energy space and why that's important and how there's so many opportunities. It doesn't really matter if you maybe went to school for finance, you have a place in the energy space. And we really dove into that in episode 106. The profitable data. So like this was a very interesting episode as well. We sat down with Hazel of Ecolytics, and it's a software program or platform that's allowing companies to build data around their sustainability program. So like there's a time period where we weren't really collecting all the information we needed to be sustainable. And there's a tool that's being designed for that particular process. And the reason why this data is so profitable, it allows people to understand what systems and steps they need to take in order for us to function in a more sustainable process. So always happy to cheer on Hazel and the work that they're doing there. Episode 108, we talked to Elsbeth of VegTech, and she really spent some time on understanding even more specifically into plant-based innovations and spending time on how to create more systems for that type of food flow to happen and people to be able to eat things that are better for them, but with the systems designed to flow better, specifically focusing on plant-based innovations. And then I really enjoyed this episode because 109, it really broke down how the history of food can impact our environmental way of thinking and interacting with the world. We sat down with Andre Taylor, and he was able to really look at us and give us a history of like how food, scholarly matters, and storytelling can combine to make a true environmental answer when it comes to how we look at the history of food and how it impacts what we're dealing with as environmental challenges today. We dove specifically into okra in that episode. I encourage you to go back and check it out. Episode 110 was really interesting for the summer. It was like kicking off in May. We spent some time on sustainable tourism and how to think about tourism as a way of being sustainable. The episode 111 was the Mind for It, was able to sit down with Dr. Vidra and specifically talk to her about the ethics of environmental work and what the mindset is. Her work centers around resilience. And I know that if you've worked in the environmental industry like myself, you've experienced some of the highs and lows of this work. So I would say this episode would be one of encouragement, along with episode 1 with that new climate episode, Reba. But these two episodes together really help you to be assured and understanding that these are the challenges of developing an industry. And that's what we're doing. If you're working in environmental work right now, you are doing the foundational work for this industry. And so it's not going to feel great all the time. And that's just some wisdom I would impart in you, especially if you're coming in early and you're listening to this podcast and you got to this point, you're like, all right, Professor E, like, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that when you work in environmental work, it is something that is shifting constantly because we hadn't done it from the beginning, especially for the infrastructure. Now, there are tribes, cultures that have always considered the environment. So don't let me steer you wrong when I say that. But the mass majority of the influential, or the ones that have been able to have pressure, power, pursuit over our resources, haven't always thought about it. And so now there's opportunities to challenge that, to be able to establish new pathways. Episode 112, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, was recycling better defined. And that was with Evan. He really helped us understand like what it means to be one certified B Corp, and also understanding how to better recycle. And now, like I said, right, episode 113, where I'm basically coming over here, taking over the podcast for a little bit and just telling you about the recap, a little bit more about me, and some upcoming information. Again, episode 114 is going to be about the uprising of reuse and how we should really learn more about how that system is navigating into our daily lives. If you're not reusing, what are you doing? And then we're talking about cultivating leather using a vegan-friendly process. And I'm very interested in understanding that. And so if you have any questions, know that you can always email us as the word ask, at EnvAns, so the first three letters of environmental, the first three letters of answers.org, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. And your question may even be featured on the next episode of the Environmental Answers podcast. In closing, I would say I'm really looking forward to last episodes of this year. We already have some things in the book for 2026. I really appreciate all the support. If you are joining me from my class and you made it to this point in the episode, I'm going to say the secret word is, or phrase is, Rhode Island. And if you have any questions for me, you can email me. Again, also at askenvans.org. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I'm on most social media platforms, and you can just type my name in and I'll come up. All right, so thank you for listening to episode 113 of the Environmental Answers podcast, where our goal is to accelerate adoption of environmental ideas, especially those that are innovative, that are integrating new systems, because we are evolving, and that's what adaptability is, and that's what the environment is all about. And so I encourage you to stay encouraged and put that subscription button. If you're looking at YouTube, hit that button. If you're on LinkedIn, you can follow us, Facebook, like, comment, whatever you need to do to make sure you stay engaged. All right. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Environmental Answers podcast. I'll talk to you guys again soon. Bye.